Okay, so welcome to the pre-lecture video for the absorptive state. So we've just spent a lot of time talking about the movement of molecules from the intestine and into the blood. And what we're really going to talk about today is what do we do with those macromolecules? Why do we waste so much energy and take so much energy? It's not wasted. Why do we take so much energy to try and move these molecules, glucose, fats, and amino acids into the bloodstream? What do we do with those? So really what we're going to be talking about today is what happens to food between digestion and storage. So why do we eat food in the first place? All right. So we all eat food. We all expend energy during exercise, sleeping, just being. But what you need to know is where does that energy come from? Okay. So what happens is we take the food that we eat and we convert it to an energy substrate, an energy currency that we use in our cells. And that energy currency is called ATP. Okay? So, the other thing that's important is we don't just use all of the energy. We don't just consume the amount of energy that we need and then that's it. Otherwise, we would be constantly needing to consume food, right? And so what we have the ability to do in addition to making ATP that sustains life and sustains us, is we have the ability to store excess nutrients. And biologically, storing makes good sense. All right, so humans have evolved under conditions where we had fasting, conditions where we were fasting, and conditions where we had great abundance. Okay, and so there are times during these feasts and these famines where it's really important that we had the ability to store energy, because when you store energy, now when food is scarce, you actually have an energy source that you can call upon to deliver and produce those that energy currency, that ATP that you need in your cells. Okay, so it's important to think about what are we doing? What are we using these nutrients for? We're using them to make ATP, but we're also taking and we're storing all the excess nutrients as either fat or sugar within our body. And the sugar molecule that we store, the long-term storage of sugar, is called glycogen. But you will see that we will store the vast majority of the food that we eat in the form of fat. Okay? And there's lots of reasons why that is. We don't actually have a storage site for amino acids. So if you eat a ton of protein, that protein is going to get converted to fat, and we're going to actually store it as fat. Right? All the protein in your body that you have is actually performing a function. So we really don't have this little kind of bank or storage site for protein. We do have a little storage site for sugar, and we call that glycogen, and we have actually a massive storage site for fat. And as you can see, around us, especially in the US, people have a pretty expansive storage for adipose tissue, or fat tissue. So we have this ability to really expand that tissue, expand that storage site if necessary. And evolutionarily, this has made a lot of sense. This has been really good for us, and this is what has allowed us to be able to pass through kind of extensive periods of feasts and famines. All right, so let's talk about metabolism. So metabolism is really going to be the sum of the chemical reactions in the body. So we extract energy from the nutrients that we're eating, and we use that energy to do work. Okay, and so some of the chemical reactions are just extracting the energy from nutrients. Use that energy to do work, and then we store excess energy mostly in the form of lipid. Okay, we store a little bit in the form of sugar, but we store the vast majority in the form of lipids. All right, there are two types of pathways that you guys need to think about. We have anabolic pathways. You can think of anabolic steroids. When you think of anabolic steroids, you can think of kind of building muscle. So anabolic pathways synthesize larger molecules from smaller ones. These pathways tend to be active mostly in the fed state, or what we call the absorptive state. That makes sense because you have lots of nutrients around, so it makes sense that we would start to synthesize larger molecules, and lots of building kind of pathways, making new cells. Those tend to be active during the fed state or the absorptive state. Now, we also have catabolic pathways, and catabolic pathways break down large molecules into smaller ones. Right? These reactions tend to be favored in the fasted state, or what we call the post-absorptive state. Anytime you're not eating, we tend to start to break down the storage sites that we have within our bodies and release those energy nutrients into the bloodstream so that they can be made into ATP. Okay, so one example might be the release of glucose molecules from the breakdown of glycogen. Okay, remember glycogen is our storage site for glucose, so we start breaking glycogen down into glucose molecules, put those in the blood. That would be an example of a catabolic pathway. All right, so let's give you a few more anabolic and catabolic pathways. These are the main pathways that you're going to need to know about for the exam. Now, this sounds and looks like a lot of jargon, but recognize that these pathways are really telling you exactly what they do. So it's not as hard as you might think to kind of follow this. So let's start with the anabolic pathways. These, again, tend to be active during the fed state. So glycogenesis is the formation of glycogen. Now, it tells you kind of what it is in the name. Glyco for glycogen, and genesis means formation of. Okay, so genesis means formation. So if you see glycogenesis, that means you're forming new glycogen. So it's the formation of glycogen. Now let's use the same idea with lipogenesis. Lipogenesis is the formation of lipids. Lipo means lipid, lipo for lipid, genesis for formation of, so you're forming new lipids. Okay, gluconeogenesis is the formation of glucose. Now, this process happens in the post-absorptive state, and this will make sense kind of when we get to the post-absorptive state, why our bodies would actually want to make glucose when you're not eating. But recognize this was going to happen in the post-absorptive state, but nonetheless, let's look at the name and what does it tell you? Gluco for glucose, neo means new, and that's important because the liver is synthesizing new glucose from substrates that were not glucose before. So for example, the liver can take amino acids and it can convert it to glucose. Okay, amino acids were not glucose before. So gluconeogenesis is the formation of new glucose that from substrates that were not once glucose. Okay, I say that because if we contrast that with glycogenolysis, glycogen for glycogen, and lysis is the breakdown of glycogen. Glycogenolysis is basically the release of glucose molecules from glycogen, and that's not gluconeogenesis because glycogen is basically a bunch of glucose molecules all strung together. Okay, so gluconeogenesis is really the formation of glucose from a substrate that was not once glucose. Here we have lots of glucose molecules strung together, so they always existed as glucose molecules. Now they're just basically tethered together, and the release of those individual glucose monomers is glycogenolysis. Okay, now lysis means breakdown, so anytime you see that word, I want you to think about breakdown. So glycogenolysis is the breakdown of glycogen, lipolysis is the breakdown of lipids. Okay, so lipo for lipids, lysis means breakdown. So these pathways pathways should tell you a little bit about what they do. Now, I've also added here that these three pathways here are important in the post-absorptive state, whereas glycogenesis and lipogenesis are important in the absorptive state. Okay. All right, let's talk about ingested energy. So we have ingested biomolecules, and they have three fates. Okay, what's going to happen to the molecules that you've taken in, and now they're in the bloodstream? Well, they're going to either be converted to energy, ATP, to do mechanical work. Mechanical work might be contracting your muscles. Remember that ATP is required for muscle contraction. So some of those energy molecules might be converted to ATP, which will help you contract the muscles in your body. Some of those ingested biomolecules might help you for growth and maintenance of your cells. So if you take in some amino acids, remember all of the proteins in our body are made up of amino acids. Those proteins, those amino acids might go into making and synthesizing new protein that you need within your body. All right. And then lastly, any excess amino acids or any excess sugar or any excess fat that you might have taken in, that can be stored as either glycogen or fat. So you're either going to use it in two different ways here, to do mechanical work, to synthesize new cells or new growth, or you're going to store it. Okay, we don't end up wasting it. Okay, so we don't end up secreting glycogen or any excess fat or back into the intestine, and we don't filter it to the kidneys and get rid of it in the urine. These molecules are like gold in our body, and so we want to store them and keep them, and they protect us against times when we don't have food around. Now, we have three nutrient pools that are available. what I mean here is that we have basically in your diet, if you think about anything that you've eaten today, think back to something you've eaten today. And what you can do is your body can break that food particle, that whatever you ate, down into 3 main pools. That's kind of an amazing idea, right? I remember where I was when I realized that this happened. And it was amazing to me that I could go out and I could eat a cheeseburger, and the fat could be extracted. There's some sugar that's present in the bun maybe, and there's some amino acids that are present in the meat that I might be eating or the cheese. And your body basically can take whatever you put into it and break it down into these 3 pools. And that's amazing. You could go out and you could eat dirt. You could eat a plant from the ground and eat some of that dirt, and the same thing. Your body will be able to start to pull out these 3 nutrient pools from whatever it is you ate. Okay, and you'll start to absorb those into your bloodstream, and that's amazing. Okay, we don't even have machines that are able to do this. It'd be really difficult to create a machine that would be able to digest food and be able to kind of pull these 3 nutrients out from the food that we're eating, the way that our GI tract is able to do that. Okay, so we have fatty acids, that's your fat. We have glucose, which is the sugar that comes from any carbs that you might have eaten, any pasta, any bread, any pure sugar, anything and a lot of the sugar in the pop that you might be drinking. And then we have amino acids that are going to come from any protein. So that could be plant-based protein, but this could also be animal-based protein as well. All right, so we take those nutrients, and what we're going to do is we're either going to remember use them, make ATP, we're going to use them to help us build and synthesize new cells, and then everything else is going to be stored. Okay, so we only have 2 storage sites in our body for these nutrients. So sugar can really only be stored as glycogen in its pure form, okay, while it's still a sugar molecule. All right, so glycogen is a storage site for sugar. There's really only a couple places in the body where we have larger amounts of glycogen, and that's in the liver and skeletal muscle. Okay, in the liver and skeletal muscle, or in the skeletal muscle mainly, and in the liver, I suppose, these are a rapid source of energy. Okay, it's really easy to cleave off one of these glucose molecules. As you can see, glycogen is this huge branching network of glucose molecules. And so it's really easy to break this linker bond between these 2 glucose molecules and free glucose up so that you can undergo glycolysis and you can metabolize it and produce some ATP from that molecule. So in the muscle actually uses its own glycogen to make ATP in case you need it. So a lot of times this is one of the first things that happens if you're exercising right away. You start breaking down some of the glycogen that's present in your skeletal muscle, and your skeletal muscle uses that to make ATP, and this helps keep your muscles rich with ATP, and so you can keep contracting them and you don't get tired. In the liver, this glycogen is actually many times released back into the bloodstream to help feed the brain, and we will talk about that in the post-absorptive state lecture, and we'll get to that in the future. All right, recognize too that this storage site is really, really tall, or it's really, really small. And so this storage site, we don't actually store a lot of glucose in the form of glycogen. And the reason is because this molecule is very, very heavy within our body. Okay, and part of that has to do with the fact that glycogen needs to be dissolved in the plasma or dissolved in the intracellular fluid. And so that means that this has to be hydrated. So there has to be water molecules that basically help dissolve this molecule wherever it exists. And because you need so much water to dissolve this large molecule, it makes it very, very heavy. Okay, and so it's actually because fats don't need water to dissolve. Fats actually aren't dissolvable in water, not very soluble. Fats like to associate with fats, and so essentially what happens is we basically get huge basically oil droplets present in our cells where the fat associates with itself, and those oil droplets are very, very light. So everything else that we take in excess, amino acids, glucose, fats, we're going to store that in as fat within our body. Fats have almost 10 times the energy content as the equal amount of carbohydrate or protein. So fat, a small molecule has the same weight of a molecule has 10 times more energy the potential for making energy as a carbohydrate or protein, which is kind of amazing. And energy in fats, though, the downside is that it's harder and slower to access. So it takes a little while for us to call upon our fat cells to release those triglycerides, which is what I'm showing you here, release the triglycerides out into the bloodstream. That needs to diffuse to where that bloodstream needs to carry that molecule wherever it needs to go in the body, that and then diffuse into the cell, be broken down, made into ATP, and then you can perform its function. So it's not quite as fast as the release of glucose molecules from the breakdown of glycogen. But we have much more potential energy that's being stored in the form of fats as compared to the storage for glycogen. All right, this is where I'm going to leave you. Maybe the last thing I wanted to point out with this picture is this is what a triglyceride looks like. So a triglyceride is the tri comes from 3 fatty acids, okay? And 3 fatty acids are shown here as these long carbon chains. And the glycerol, so triglyceride, the glyceride part, it comes from the glycerol backbone that you see here. This is a carbon here. This is a carbon here, and this is a carbon here. And those carbons are linked to the fatty acids through an ester bond. Okay, so we basically have 3 carbons here. We have oxygen, 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 and then it's linked to these long fatty acid tails. Okay, so it's kind of important to think about the structure of the triglyceride, and that helps to kind of understand how it's broken down. It might help you understand how it's broken down in the intestine and how it needs to be broken down when it travels through the body. This molecule is actually fairly large, and so this doesn't have the ability to diffuse through membranes. So every time you move through a membrane, this molecule has to be broken down and then reassembled. All right, that's all I'm going to talk about. Remember, though, that the food that we eat, we need to store it or we need to use it. And so what we're going to talk about in class is really the storage piece for the absorptive state. So what happens? How is it that we store glucose? How is it that what happens to amino acids? How can we make amino acids into triglycerides? And how do we store triglycerides? And how do triglycerides travel kind of in the bloodstream? That's where we're going to be going. So I will leave you here, and I will see you in class. Thanks for listening.